The plant looked perfect. My basket was empty, so I kept picking. What I did not realize was that I was taking more than today's harvest. I was cutting into what the plant needed to build the next one. And one of the plants in this garden will eventually teach us something even stranger. Sometimes the smartest harvest is the one you decide not to take. For a long time, I thought harvesting was the easy part of container gardening. You wait, you water, you watch the weather, you check the leaves. Then one morning, the plant finally looks full, healthy, and ready. So you bring out a basket and start taking everything that looks good. It feels productive. Every leaf feels like proof that the weeks of care were worth it. The basket gets heavier and the plant still looks green, so you keep going. Maybe one more leaf, then another. Later, the container looks different. Not dead, just quieter. New growth seems slower, and the plant no longer has that same full shape. You wait for another harvest, but it does not arrive the way you expected. That is usually when we start blaming the wrong thing. Maybe the potting mix is bad. Maybe the seed was weak. Maybe the weather changed. Sometimes one of those things really is the problem. But there is another question that is easy to miss. Was the plant actually finished? Or did I help finish it too early? That question changed the way I look at productive containers. Before I reach for a leaf, a stalk, or a ripe fruit, I ask two things. What is ready now? And what is the plant using to make what comes next? Those are not always the same part of the plant. Kale makes this easy to see. Stand in front of a healthy container of kale, and your eyes usually go to the biggest leaves first. They are broad, mature, and easy to reach. They look like the obvious reward. And in many cases, those larger outer or lower leaves are exactly where I begin. I take the mature leaves I actually plan to use, but then I stop. That pause matters. Instead of looking at the basket, I look back at the plant. I follow the stem upward and pay attention to the active growth near the top. The leaves there are smaller. Some are still opening around the center of growth. That unfinished area is important. The problem is letting the excitement of a full basket pull your cutting hand farther and farther toward the active top until you remove or damage the area organizing the next leaves. You do not need a complicated rule or an exact number of leaves to understand the principle. Look at the plant in front of you. Take mature growth. Protect the active growth that is still building. A large lower leaf that is mature and useful in the kitchen is not the same as a small new leaf near the growing area. One is today's food. The other is part of the plant's future structure. You pick a few mature leaves. You place them in the basket. Then you step back. The basket has kale, but the top of the plant still looks alive, organized, and unfinished. That unfinished look is exactly what I want. The goal is not to make the plant look harvested. The goal is to take food while leaving the plant with a clear way to continue. Now look at Swiss chard, because the same idea appears in a completely different shape. Kale teaches you to look higher. Swiss chard asks you to look down into the center. Imagine the plant like a bowl. The large leaves open around the outside. Their stalks are thick, colorful, and easy to see. In the middle, smaller leaves are packed more tightly together. They are not yet the main harvest. They are the plant's developing center. This is where Swiss chard can get us into trouble. The whole plant looks edible because the whole plant is colorful. Red stalks, yellow stalks, white stalks, big green leaves. But appearance and harvest stage are not the same thing. I start with the mature outer growth. I look for leaves that have opened fully and reached a useful size for the kitchen. I remove those selectively, then I look back into the center before I take another one. The center should still look busy. If the colorful center is still crowded with small developing leaves, I can see that the plant still has active work in progress. The basket has food, but the container still has a future. Every leaf you remove changes the plant. That does not mean harvesting is harmful. It means harvesting is an action the plant has to respond to. If you remove mature leaves and protect the developing center, the plant still has active growth and remaining foliage. If you keep going simply because the basket is not full, you may leave it with much less working leaf area than you intended. This is where the basket itself becomes dangerous. Not because baskets are bad, of course, but because they change the way we measure success. You see 6 beautiful leaves, then 8, then 10. The plant is still green, so it feels harmless to take one more. The basket starts looking like the goal. But the basket is only showing you what left the garden. It is not showing you what the plant still needs. That is why I often pause halfway through harvesting Swiss chard and look at the container from above. From that angle, it is easier to compare the large outer leaves with the small leaves still developing in the middle. What I am really asking is simple. Am I taking mature growth, or am I starting to cut into the next stage? Collard greens make that question even more important because they can look strong long after you have taken more than you planned. A healthy collard plant can carry large leaves that invite a heavy harvest. The lower leaves are broad. The plant may be tall. There may be many leaves that are technically edible, and that word edible can create another mistake. Edible does not automatically mean take it all now. With collards, I think in terms of gradual removal. I begin with mature, lower leaves that fit my harvest goal. Then, I reassess the plant. I do not strip it simply because I can. This matters because a green plant can still be left with less working foliage than you intended. A plant does not have to look dead to be over-harvested. Sometimes the first sign is simply slower recovery, weaker new growth, or a longer wait for the next useful harvest. And when that happens, many gardeners blame the plant. I used to do the same thing. I would look at a tired container and think the variety was not productive. The pot was in the wrong place, or the plant had reached the end of its useful life. But then I started thinking about the harvest itself. How much did I take? Where did I take it from? What did the plant still have when I walked away? That last question is the one I had ignored for years. With kale, I want the active top to remain organized and growing. With Swiss chard, I want the developing center to stay crowded with smaller leaves. With collards, I want the plant to keep enough healthy foliage and active growth that I am not turning one good harvest into a long recovery period. Notice what I am not saying. Do not be afraid to harvest, and do not leave every beautiful leaf untouched because you are worried about the future. One extra leaf is not a magic disaster. The point is much simpler. Harvesting is part of plant management. Once you understand that, you stop treating the basket as the only measure of success. After I finish with a container, I look at its shape. Does it still have active growth? Can I identify the part that is building the next leaves? Did I take mature material? Or did I cut deeply into new growth because everything looked edible? Those few seconds of observation can change the way you manage the entire season. And this is where the idea of multiple harvests becomes more interesting. A plant does not give you another harvest because you used the right gardening phrase. It does not care that we call it cut and come again. It responds to the condition it is left in, the growth it still has, the roots supporting it, the moisture around those roots, the nutrition available, the season, and the normal biology of that plant. We will get to those limits. But first, learn to see the next harvest while the current one is still in your hand. On kale, look toward the active top. On Swiss chard, look into the colorful center. On collards, look at the remaining foliage and ask whether the plant still looks capable of comfortable recovery. 3 plants, 3 slightly different ways of looking. One shared lesson. Take what is ready. Protect what is still building. And then stop long enough to notice the difference. Because the next group of plants creates a new problem. One of them has a name that makes it sound almost impossible to exhaust. That name can make a gardener far too confident. Kale taught us to protect active growth. Chard taught us to watch the center. Collards showed us that a plant can still look green after we have taken more than we intended. Now we need to deal with plants that practically invite us to keep cutting. Perpetual spinach is a place to continue because its name can make a gardener overconfident. Perpetual. That word sounds like a promise. It sounds as if the plant will keep giving no matter how often you cut, how much you take, or how tired the container becomes. But plant names are not care instructions. This plant can be very useful when you want repeated leaf harvests, yet long producing does not mean indestructible. The same question still matters. What are you taking now, and what are you leaving the plant to work with next? I look for mature leaves that have reached a useful size. I harvest what I plan to eat, then stop and look for smaller growth that is still developing. I also look at the overall condition of the plant. Are the new leaves opening normally? Does the plant still have healthy foliage? Is growth active, or am I cutting simply because the name has convinced me the plant should never slow down? When something is called perpetual spinach, every slowdown can feel like a failure. We assume the plant is supposed to continue forever, so we keep pushing it. But a long harvest period is not permission to ignore stress. If growth becomes weak, if the leaves are no longer giving you the quality you want, or if the plant is clearly struggling, the answer is not always another cut. Sometimes the useful thing is to pause and ask why the plant is slowing down. The season may be changing, the roots may be crowded, moisture may be inconsistent, the container may need attention, or the plant may simply need time to rebuild after repeated harvests. We will come back to those limits. For now, remember this: perpetual is a name. It is not permission to stop observing the plant. Leaf lettuce creates another problem because it looks so complete. A beautiful head can look like a finished object. The leaves overlap. The shape is full. Everything seems to say, cut me once and carry me inside. If you want the whole head, harvest it according to the lettuce you are growing and how you plan to use it. The mistake is not harvesting a whole head. The mistake is harvesting a whole head and expecting the plant to behave as though you only borrowed a few leaves. Those are two different strategies. With many leaf lettuces, selective harvest can give you a different experience. Instead of treating the plant as one complete head, you can look at larger outer leaves first and leave younger growth developing toward the center. Again, the important word is selective. I am not racing around the plant, taking every leaf that has reached an edible size. I am choosing mature leaves for the kitchen while paying attention to what remains. Then I step back. The basket tells me what I have taken. The plant tells me whether my harvest goal still makes sense. If I wanted one beautiful full head, a full head harvest may be exactly right. If I wanted repeated leaf harvests, removing the whole plant and expecting the same result makes no sense. That is one of the biggest mistakes beginners make with multiple harvest gardening. We hear that a plant can be harvested more than once, then assume every harvesting method should lead to repeated production. It does not work that way. The way you harvest has to match the outcome you want. Arugula makes the lesson even more interesting, because now we need to ask a question that has nothing to do with whether the plant can technically produce another leaf. We need to ask whether the next harvest is still worth having. Arugula can give repeated harvest opportunities when managed appropriately, especially while the plant is producing tender growth you enjoy. But plants change as they move through their growth stages. Leaves may become stronger in flavor. Texture can change. The plant may begin moving toward flowering. Conditions can push that process faster or slower. So I stop using regrowth as the only measure of success. Yes, the plant may still be alive. Yes, it may still produce more leaves. But do I still want those leaves? That is a different question. Multiple harvests are useful only while the crop is still giving you something you actually want to eat. Gardeners sometimes become so focused on extending a plant that we forget why we planted it. We keep cutting. We keep waiting. We watch a tired crop produce growth we enjoy less, and we call that success because technically the plant has not stopped. But the goal of a food garden is not to prove that a plant can survive our persistence. The goal is useful food. With arugula, I pay attention to leaf quality, flavor, plant stage, and the conditions around the container. If the crop is still giving me leaves I enjoy, repeated harvest can make sense. If the plant is moving into a stage where quality no longer matches what I want, I do not feel guilty about changing the plan. Knowing when to start fresh is also a gardening skill. Keep that idea in mind, because later we are going to meet plants where patience matters even more. One of them will ask us to leave a perfectly edible harvest standing right in front of us. But before we get there, the entire shape of the next harvest is about to change. So far, the future has been hiding in leaves. With kale, it was the active top. With Swiss chard, it was the colourful centre. With collards, it was the remaining healthy foliage and active growth. With perpetual spinach, it was the developing leaves we protected instead of assuming the plant could never tire. With lettuce and arugula, our harvest goal and the quality we wanted helped decide what happened next. Now, look up. Egyptian walking onions build their future in a way that almost looks like the plant is trying to leave the container. The name sounds strange until you see the structure. A tall stalk rises above the leaves. At the top, clusters of small bulbils can form. As that structure becomes heavier, the stalk may bend toward the ground. Where those bulbils reach suitable soil, new growth can begin. The plant is not literally walking, of course, but from one generation of growth to the next, it can slowly move across a garden bed. In a container, we manage that habit more deliberately. What matters for this story is that the next harvest is no longer a replacement leaf hiding near a center. The plant is building another kind of future above the soil. You can look at the top of the stalk and see a structure that may become planting material, edible growth, or part of the plant's continuing cycle, depending on how you manage it. That changes the harvest question again. With kale, I asked which mature leaves were ready. With walking onions, I may be deciding what to eat, what to leave, and what I want to use to continue the planting. Do I want edible onion growth now? Do I want to preserve some bulbils for future planting? Do I want to manage the clump so it remains useful in the space I have? The correct answer depends on the garden. And that is the larger lesson. Multiple harvest gardening is not one technique repeated on 15 plants. It is a way of reading different production systems. Sometimes the next harvest is a small leaf. Sometimes it is active growth you protect. Sometimes it is a new plant structure developing above the soil. And very soon, we are going to look below the soil, where the future becomes harder to see. You can see the outer kale leaves. You can look directly into the center of Swiss chard. You can compare the remaining foliage on collards. You can watch arugula quality change. You can follow a walking onion stalk from the base to the bulbils at the top. The garden starts becoming less mysterious. Once you recognize that the next harvest can be a leaf, a growing center, or even a new plant structure, you stop asking one question over and over. How much can I take? You start asking better questions. What stage is this plant in? What part is mature? What part is still developing? What do I want from this container next? Those questions are more useful than any promise of an endless harvest. Because no plant is truly endless. A plant can be productive for a long period. It can regrow. It can return. It can keep flowering. It can build new structures. But those processes depend on the plant, the season, the roots, the water, the nutrition, and the decisions we make. The best multiple harvest garden is not the one where you force every plant to continue as long as possible. It is the one where you understand what kind of continuation each plant is capable of. Perpetual spinach taught us not to trust a name more than the plant in front of us. Lettuce taught us that harvest methods need to match harvest goals. Arugula taught us that another harvest is not valuable if we no longer want the quality it gives us. And Egyptian walking onions showed us that the next harvest may be completely different from the one we just took. Now the story moves lower. What happens when the harvest is not a leaf and the future is not hanging above the soil? What happens when the productive part is hidden in a clump, a root, or a crown? The next plants force us to look below the line we have been watching. And eventually, one of them will ask us to do something that feels completely wrong after all this talk about harvesting. It will ask us to leave perfectly edible food untouched. Once you understand why, the way you measure a productive container begins to change again. Chives bring the idea back down to something familiar. They do not look dramatic. No tall stalk bending under bulbils. No bright fruit changing color in the sun. just a clump of narrow green leaves. And that simplicity can make us careless. A healthy clump of chives can look like one endless haircut. Cut it. Wait. Cut it again. The plant comes back, so the temptation is to treat the clump like a green machine that never needs a pause. But I have learned to look at the clump as the productive unit. I am not only looking at one leaf, I am looking at density, fresh growth, the condition of the base, and how the whole clump is responding to repeated harvests. If I only need a small handful for dinner, I do not have to flatten the entire container just because the leaves are edible. I can take what I need, keep the cut clean, and leave healthy growth behind. Then I watch what happens. Does the clump continue to send up fresh leaves? Does the new growth look strong? Am I cutting faster than the plant is rebuilding? That question matters more than the calendar. The clump is the schedule. Its growth tells you whether the rhythm still makes sense. And chives are a useful bridge, because the next harvest is no longer organized around a single, obvious center. The productive structure is spread through a clump. Now move lower. Horseradish forces us to think below the soil line. Above the container, the leaves may look vigorous and obvious, but the part many gardeners want is hidden underground. That means the harvest can disturb the very place where part of the plant's future is stored. With a leaf crop, the future is often visible. You can point to a young leaf or see a growing tip. With horseradish, part of the story is buried in soil you are about to move. I think about the harvest goal before I start digging. Am I taking part of the root for the kitchen? Am I managing a plant I want to keep in the container? Am I trying to remove more of it because I do not want it continuing there? Those are very different intentions. And horseradish is exactly the kind of plant that punishes vague intentions. If you dig without a plan, you can disturb the container far more than expected. You may remove useful root, leave pieces behind, or change the plant's ability to continue in ways that are not obvious from the leaves above. So before the soil moves, the question has to become more precise. What am I harvesting? And what do I want this container to do afterward? That is the first time in this garden where the future becomes harder to see. And then, rhubarb makes the idea even bigger. A mature rhubarb plant can look almost excessive. Huge leaves spread over the container. Thick stalks rise from the base. The plant has visual weight. It looks strong enough to give and give. That appearance invites confidence. Because with rhubarb, the stalk is not the whole story. The crown is the long-term engine. The stalk in your hand is today's harvest. The crown you leave undisturbed is the part you are trusting with future growth. I like to think of it this way. The stalk is the paycheck. The crown is the business. If you only look at the paycheck, you can forget what has to remain healthy for another one to exist. This is especially important with young or recently established plants. A plant that is still building strength should not be judged by how quickly it can fill your basket. That is hard because visible abundance creates pressure to harvest. You see thick stalks and think the plant has plenty. But long-term plants have a different relationship with time. A leafy green may replace leaves quickly during active growth. A rhubarb crown is building a structure you expect to rely on over a much longer period. So restraint becomes part of the strategy. I am not saying never harvest rhubarb. I am saying the plant's age, establishment, vigor, and condition should be part of the decision. The goal is not to prove the plant can survive a heavy harvest. The goal is to enjoy the crop while respecting the structure that makes future growth possible. And then we reach the plant I mentioned at the beginning. Now I am going to tell you not to harvest. At least, not yet. Asparagus is one of the strangest lessons in a video about repeated harvests, because the edible part can be standing in front of you, looking exactly like the thing you planted the crop to produce, and the smartest decision may be to leave it alone. That feels wrong. You have waited, you have watered, you have protected the container. Then a spear rises from the soil, and every instinct says, this is the reward. But a young or insufficiently established asparagus plant may need growth more than your basket needs that spear. The plant has to build strength. When spears develop into fern growth, that foliage supports the crown and root system future production depends on. So sometimes the harvest strategy is restraint. Waiting feels unproductive only when the basket is the only thing you are measuring. If my only measure is what I carry into the kitchen today, leaving an edible spear untouched feels like failure. But if I am measuring the strength of the plant I want to harvest from later, the decision looks completely different. The same garden, the same spear, a different definition of success. This is why multiple harvest gardening cannot be reduced to one phrase, like cut and come again. Chives rebuild a clump. Horseradish makes you think underground. Rhubarb asks you to protect a crown. Asparagus may ask you to walk away from something edible, because the plant is still building the structure. Future harvests depend on different plants, different systems. And suddenly harvesting more becomes less about taking more and more about timing. Take what is ready when the plant is ready to give it. Protect the structure that makes the next stage possible. Recognize when patience is doing more for the garden than another full basket. By now, the pattern may feel clear. Find the mature part. Protect what produces next. Know when to leave the plant alone. That sounds almost complete, but there is a problem. You can make the right cut on kale. Protect the center of Swiss chard. Harvest lettuce according to your goal. Watch arugula quality. Manage walking onions with a plan. Leave a rhubarb crown undisturbed, and give young asparagus time to build strength. And a container plant can still slow down. That is where many gardeners become confused. The harvest technique was correct. The growing point was protected. The plant was not stripped. So why does the next useful harvest still seem farther away? The answer may be hidden against the wall of the container. Above the soil, a plant can look as if it has unlimited space. Leaves spread into open air. Stems move in the breeze. Sunlight reaches the canopy. Below the soil, the story can be completely different. The roots cannot simply keep exploring. They meet the container. They circle. They fill available space. They compete inside a limited volume of potting mix for moisture and nutrients. A plant in the ground may be able to explore a broader area. A plant in a container has to keep rebuilding leaves, stalks, flowers, and fruit from resources held inside a much smaller zone. That changes everything about repeated production. Every harvest removes plant material from the system. A kale leaf leaves in your basket. A chive cutting leaves in your hand. A rhubarb stalk leaves the plant. Later, a tomato, pepper, or eggplant will leave the container and go into the kitchen. The plant has to build living tissue again while its roots remain in the same space. This is where a perfect harvest cut can still lead to a tired plant. Not because the cut was wrong, because correct harvesting does not cancel the limits of the container. The roots still need room that makes sense for the mature plant. The potting mix still has to hold and release moisture in a useful way. The plant still needs access to appropriate nutrition. Harvest timing still interacts with weather, season, and plant condition. This is the hidden problem underneath every productive container. We spend so much time looking above the soil that we forget the part supporting all of it. Cannot walk away and search for more. The roots stay where we put them. And once I understood that, I stopped asking only whether I was harvesting correctly. I started asking a second question. Does this container still have the capacity to support what I am asking the plant to rebuild? That question matters even more once we reach fruiting plants. A fruiting plant is not only replacing one leaf. It may be holding mature fruit, developing fruit, flowers, new stems, and leaves at the same time. A productive tomato or pepper can look generous above the soil, while asking a great deal from a limited root zone below it. So before we look at the ripe fruit, we need to understand 4 things that keep the production cycle moving: root space, moisture, replacement nutrition, and harvest timing. These are not 4 tricks. They are 4 limits. And the next plants make every one of those limits visible. The roots stay where we put them. It sounds obvious, but it changes how I think about productive containers. A tomato can spread vine into open air. A pepper can carry fruit at several stages. Kale can keep sending out leaves. Above the soil, growth looks free. Below it, every plant is working inside a boundary. That is why root space is the first limit I look at. I do not mean every plant needs the biggest pot I can find. The container still has to suit the plant, the space, and the way I manage water. The root zone should match the mature plant and the production I expect from it. If I ask a restricted volume of potting mix to support a large canopy, repeated flowering, and developing fruit, the plant may begin showing me the limits of that arrangement. Sometimes the container looks fine from across the patio. The leaves are green. There may even be flowers. But when I inspect the root ball carefully, the story can be crowded. Roots may be pressing against the wall or filling much of the available mix. The lesson is not to panic when you see roots. It is to remember that a container defines the plant's search area. In the ground, roots may explore farther for water and nutrients. In a pot, the gardener is responsible for nearly everything that enters that small system. That brings us to moisture. A container can lose water quickly in warm, windy weather. A pot in full sun may behave differently from one in partial shade. A mature fruiting plant can use water very differently from a young transplant. That is why I do not trust one universal watering sentence. Water every morning sounds simple, but the plant does not read the clock. I check the potting mix. I notice the weight of a container when practical. I watch the plant, the weather, the container size, and how quickly the root zone is drying. The goal is not to keep the pot constantly soaked. The goal is to avoid managing water by habit when the container is telling me something different. Consistency matters. A productive plant may be holding leaves, building new stems, opening flowers, and enlarging fruit. If the root zone repeatedly swings from very dry to heavily saturated because I ignored the container and then tried to compensate all at once, I am adding another challenge. So I stop treating water as a separate chore. Water is part of the harvest system. The same is true of nutrition. Every time food leaves a container in my basket, the plant still has to build living tissue behind it. That does not mean I pour fertilizer into the pot after every harvest. It means I remember that repeated production is not free. What the plant needs depends on the crop, the mix, the stage of growth, and the product or amendment being used. I follow appropriate directions. I do not assume more feeding means more harvest, and I pay attention to the plant instead of chasing a miracle recipe. But I also do not expect a heavily productive container to keep rebuilding indefinitely from a pantry I never restock. You cannot keep asking a small kitchen to serve dinner without restocking the pantry. The plant is the kitchen. The root zone is the pantry. Harvest after harvest is the dinner leaving through the door. Then there is harvest timing. This fourth limit is easy to misunderstand. Harvest timing does not mean one perfect clock for every crop. The stage at which I harvest should match the food I want and the plant I am trying to manage. With leafy crops, I may choose mature leaves while protecting active growth. With arugula, quality changes the decision. With rhubarb or asparagus, establishment changes it. With fruiting plants, one plant may carry several stages of production at the same time. This is where indeterminate tomatoes change the entire picture. Stand beside a healthy indeterminate tomato in a container and look at one ripe fruit. It is bright, it is obvious, it is ready to come inside. But the ripe tomato is only the loudest part of the plant. Pick it, then do not leave. Stay with the vine. Look slightly higher or farther along the stem. There may be green tomatoes still enlarging. Beyond those, smaller fruit may just be developing. Then a flower cluster. Then fresh, growing tissue. Do not look at one tomato. Look 3 harvests ahead. That does not mean I can predict exactly how many tomatoes the plant will produce. Weather can change. Flowers may not set fruit. Pests, disease, heat, and plant stress can alter the story. The point is not prediction. The point is observation. The ripe tomato is one stage. The green fruit is another. The flowers represent possibility. The growing tip is still building structure. That is a living production line. And now the 4 container limits become easy to see. Does the root zone have enough space for the mature plant I am asking it to support? Is moisture being managed consistently for the conditions? Am I supporting the crop appropriately as it continues building leaves, stems, flowers, and fruit? Am I harvesting mature fruit according to my use while still paying attention to the rest of the plant? These questions are connected. A ripe tomato does not exist by itself. It is attached to a plant that is still managing every stage behind it. This is why I do not judge an indeterminate tomato only by the number of red fruits visible on one afternoon. I look at the whole production line. Sometimes a plant has beautiful ripe fruit, but little active growth left. Sometimes the root zone is drying too quickly. Sometimes there are flowers, but the plant is clearly stressed. The harvest in my hand may still be excellent, but the plant behind it tells me what I should expect next. The variety matters. The season matters. The container matters. The plant in front of me matters. And peppers make this production line even easier to see. A healthy pepper plant can carry mature fruit, green developing fruit, tiny newly formed fruit, and an open flower within a surprisingly small area. That is not one harvest. That is a production line at several different stages. The mature fruit gets your attention first because it is the part you can use now. But before I harvest, I look at the rest of the plant. I notice the smaller fruit. I notice flowers. I notice fresh growth. I look at the leaves and overall vigor. Then I take the mature fruit according to the variety and how I want to use it. Picking mature fruit is one part of managing a pepper through its productive season. The other part is supporting the flowers, developing fruit, leaves, stems, and roots that remain. This is where oversimplified gardening advice can become dangerous. You may hear, the more you pick, the more you get. It sounds exciting, but plants are not vending machines. Harvesting mature fruit can be part of good crop management, but it does not guarantee unlimited production. The plant still responds to genetics, temperature, light, water, nutrition, root conditions, pests, disease, and the length of the growing season. So I do not pick peppers aggressively, because I expect the plant to reward me for the act of picking. I harvest fruit when it matches my use and the stage I want. Then I support the plant carrying the rest of the production line. That distinction matters. A pepper plant with one ripe fruit and several younger stages is already showing me why multiple harvests are possible. One fruit is ready today. Another is still growing. A flower may or may not become fruit later. Fresh growth may carry future flowering sites. Nothing is guaranteed. But the plant is not working on only one moment. And once you see that, a container garden starts feeling different. You stop walking past plants asking, is there anything ripe? You start asking, what stage is this plant in? That question slows you down in a useful way. You harvest the ripe tomato, then notice the green fruit. You take a mature pepper, then notice a flower. You check the potting mix because you understand what the roots are being asked to support. You compare the container with the mature plant and ask whether repeated production is being supported rather than simply admired. Root space, moisture, replacement nutrition, harvest timing. Not 4 tricks, 4 limits that tell you how much a container can comfortably keep doing. And there is one line I want you to notice the next time you harvest a ripe fruit. Do not follow it into the kitchen immediately. Stay with the plant for 5 more seconds. Look behind the fruit you just picked. Look for the smaller fruit. Look for flowers. Look for fresh growth. Look at the leaves. Look at the soil surface and the size of the container beneath the plant. What you find behind the harvest may tell you more about the next one than the fruit in your hand. Tomatoes and peppers make the production line easy to read. One fruit is ready. Another is developing. Flowers are still asking the plant for what may come next. But eggplant and beans bring the same idea into an even smaller visual space. A mature harvest can be sitting only inches from a flower or a young fruit. And that is where the entire idea of a layered container garden finally comes together. The mature eggplant is the part everyone notices. It hangs low on the plant, glossy and heavy enough to make the branch look important. You reach in, support the fruit, make a clean harvest, and naturally, your attention follows it toward the kitchen. But do not follow that eggplant into the kitchen yet. Stay with the plant for 5 more seconds. Look near the point where the fruit was growing. Look along the nearby stems. There may be a purple flower, a much smaller fruit beginning to form, or new growth still extending the plant. The mature fruit gets the photograph. The flower and smaller fruit tell you if the story is still moving. One large eggplant can make the whole container look as if it reached its big moment. But the plant may still be carrying several stages of production around that harvest. I take mature fruit according to the variety and quality I need. Then I look at what remains. Are there flowers? Are smaller fruits developing? Does the plant still have healthy foliage and active growth? The harvest is only one answer. The remaining plant gives me new questions. Continued production is connected to plant condition, not to a magic rule that says every fruit removed creates another fruit. I do not harvest to force the plant. I harvest what is ready and then support the plant that remains. Bush beans make the same lesson easy to see because several stages can hide inside one compact plant. You walk past the container and notice one pod first. It looks ready for the kitchen. You reach in and pick it. Now, slow down. Move one leaf aside. There may be a smaller pod just behind it. A little farther in, there may be a flower. Another pod may be developing on the other side of the plant. A bean plant can turn one quick walk past the container into a missed detail. The pod you see first may be ready, but the reason to come back is growing just behind it. That is why I check bush beans regularly during their productive period. I harvest mature pods at the stage I want to use them, then notice the smaller pods and flowers that remain. A flower is possibility, not a promise. Weather, stress, pests, disease, or the season can change the outcome, but the plant may still be working at several stages at once. And that is the idea I want you to carry away from all 15 plants. The next harvest was never one thing. With the leafy crops, we learned to protect active growth, developing centers, and enough healthy foliage for the plant to continue. Perpetual spinach taught us to watch the plant instead of trusting a name. Lettuce and arugula showed us that harvest method and food quality still matter. Walking onions and chives changed the structure of the question. Horseradish moved it underground. Rhubarb put long-term value in the crown. And asparagus showed us that sometimes the best harvest decision is to wait. Tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, and bush beans made the next stages visible in fruit, flowers, young pods, and fresh growth. 15 plants, but not 15 copies of the same trick. Some replace leaves, some rebuild from clumps or long-term structures, some return through perennial growth when conditions and care are appropriate. Some keep flowering and developing fruit through a productive season. That is why I do not fill every pot with plants that behave the same way. I think in layers. One container of kale or chard may give mature leaves while younger growth remains. Another leafy crop may be rebuilding. Chives may be sending up fresh growth. A long-term crop may look almost unproductive because you are deliberately leaving it alone. Then a tomato carries green fruit above the ripe one you pick. A pepper has one mature fruit and a flower. An eggplant hides a smaller fruit behind the leaves. Bush beans ask you to look again. Nothing has to be ready at the same time. A productive small garden does not need one giant harvest on a perfect Saturday morning. It can feed you in layers. A few leaves tonight, a pepper another day, a tomato when it reaches the stage you want, beans after another check through the foliage. One plant may recover while another produces. One may flower while another is ready. A perennial may build strength while a leafy crop gives you food now. The garden is not producing everything at once. It produces at different rhythms. When space is limited, that can be more useful than one brief moment of abundance. You do not need all 15 plants. You do not need 15 containers or every crop on this list. Choose plants that fit your climate, your season, your available light, your container space, and the food you actually enjoy eating. If nobody in your home likes arugula, extending its harvest does not make your garden meaningfully more productive. If you lack the patience or conditions for a long-term crop, forcing it into the plan because it appeared on a list is not smart gardening. The best plant is the one that fits the system you can actually maintain. Maybe your garden has room for only 6 good containers. Then, every plant has to earn its space. One might give selective leaf harvests. Another may carry fruit at several stages. A third might hold chives or walking onions. Maybe you reserve space for a longer-term crop because you are willing to wait. If continuous harvest is your goal, do not expect every container to finish in the same way at the same time. Mix production rhythms, then learn the harvest language of each plant. What is mature? What is still developing? What structure produces next? What does the root zone have to support? And when should you stop asking for more? That final question may be the most important one, because multiple harvests do not mean forcing a tired plant forever. Remember the arugula. A plant can still be alive and still be giving you growth you no longer want. Remember the container roots. A plant can have the correct growing point and still be limited by a crowded or poorly supported root zone. Remember asparagus. Sometimes patience is the productive action. And sometimes the season has changed. The plant has lost vigor, quality has declined, or stress has reached a point where starting fresh makes more sense than squeezing one more harvest from a tired container. Knowing when to stop is also a harvesting skill. That does not mean giving up at one yellow leaf. It means observing the whole plant. Look at new growth and quality. Think about the root environment, the season, and the normal behavior of the crop. If the plant needs support, support it appropriately. If moisture management is the problem, correct it. If the container no longer makes sense for the mature plant, learn from that arrangement. If repeated production has drawn heavily on the container, think about appropriate nutrition for the crop and the products you use. But do not turn gardening into a contest against a tired plant. The goal is useful food from a garden you can understand and manage. That brings me back to the empty basket. At the beginning, the plant looked perfect and the basket was empty, so I kept picking. The question in my mind was simple. How much can I take today? Now I ask a different question. Before I harvest, what is ready and what is this plant using to build what comes next? The garden did not get bigger. I did not add another row of containers. What changed was the way I looked at a plant before I touched it. I stopped treating every harvest like the end of the story. I started looking for the stage behind it. A small center leaf, an active growing point, a healthy clump, a crown, a flower, a green tomato, a tiny pepper, a young eggplant, a pod hidden behind another leaf. The next harvest may already be there, while you have been looking only at the food ready today. So, before you decide that you need more pots, more soil, or a bigger garden, take one slow walk past the plants you already have. Do not reach for the scissors first. Look first, find the mature harvest. Then find the growth that comes after it. Check the plant, not just the basket. A multiple harvest garden is not built by taking as much as possible from every plant. It is built by understanding how each plant makes what comes next. Take what is ready. Protect what produces next. Give the roots the support they need to rebuild. And when a plant is truly tired, know the difference between helping it recover and asking for a harvest it can no longer comfortably give. No plant gives forever. But a small container garden can become far more useful when you stop seeing every crop as a single moment. The garden can work in layers. One plant gives, one rebuilds, one flowers, one develops fruit. One waits, and you keep returning, not because everything is ready, but because something is always moving toward the next stage. If you are building a productive garden in containers, tell me which of these plants has earned a permanent place in your space. And if this helped you look at harvesting differently, stay with me. There is always another way to help a small garden work harder without making gardening harder.